What if one of the most important discoveries in human origins was not hidden in a cave, buried beneath volcanic ash, or locked away in a forgotten museum drawer, but sitting openly inside old anthropology books that almost nobody reads anymore? What if the argument that Neanderthals were fully human, culturally advanced, socially organized, spiritually aware, and genetically connected to us was not a radical modern discovery at all, but something serious scientists were already saying nearly a century ago? And what if the real scandal is not why modern DNA proved interbreeding happened, but why the public was taught for decades that it could not happen in the first place?
Until recently, the idea that two distinct human species could interbreed and hybridize was thought to be impossible, a scientific heresy.
The real heresy was never hybridization. Evolution is built on population contact, mixture, and adaptation. The strange idea was the claim that modern humans emerged as a pure, untouched lineage that completely replaced every other human group without meaningful interbreeding. DNA shattered that narrative that Neanderthals were a separate species because small physical differences. A large nose in a cold climate is not evidence of primitiveness. A robust skeleton is not evidence of savagery. A thick neck is not a sign of bestiality. A long skull is not proof of exclusion from the modern human lineage. The strangest thing about the modern discussion surrounding Neanderthals is that scientists who promoted the increasingly implausible out-of-Africa theory speak as though the idea of interbreeding suddenly appeared after ancient DNA arrived from laboratories in Germany during the early 21st century. The public was told that the old image of Neanderthals as primitive dead ends collapsed overnight after the genome revolution. Yet when somebody begins opening anthropology texts from the 1940s, 1950s and 1960s, an entirely different picture emerges. Serious scholars already understood that Neanderthals possessed intelligence, culture, ritual behavior, organized hunting systems, social cooperation, and perhaps most importantly, biological compatibility with modern humans. Long before DNA sequencing existed, some anthropologists already concluded that Neanderthals belonged within the same human species. One of the clearest examples came from Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the central architects of modern evolutionary genetics itself. This was not some obscure fringe figure standing outside mainstream science. Dobzhansky helped create the modern synthesis that merged Darwinian evolution with genetics. His influence on 20th century evolutionary thought was enormous, yet buried inside his writings are statements that sound almost shocking when compared with the simplistic stories many people later absorbed through television specials, museum displays, and school textbooks. In 1955, Dobzhansky wrote plainly that one thing certain was that the Neanderthals belonged to the same species as modern humans. He then stated that their replacement in Europe occurred partly through destruction and partly through hybridization with incoming populations. That statement alone destroys the later claim that interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans represented some impossible or fringe speculation before genetics confirmed it. Dobzhansky predicted exactly what later DNA studies demonstrated. He understood that human evolution operated through population interaction rather than through perfectly isolated creations marching across the earth like separate biblical tribes. Even earlier, during the 1940s, Dobzhansky argued against the tendency to split every fossil population into separate species. He viewed humanity as a broad evolving system linked through gene exchange and regional variation. In his framework, Neanderthals were not some failed evolutionary experiment standing outside humanity. They were a specialized human population shaped by Ice Age conditions within the larger human family. That distinction matters enormously because it reveals how dramatically later interpretations drifted away from the perspective held by some of the founders of evolutionary biology itself. By 1962, Dobzhansky went even further in his book Mankind Evolving. There he described the Neanderthal race as an evolutionary development within the genetic system of the species Homo sapiens. Notice how different this language feels compared with the later media portrayal of Neanderthals as ape-like creatures grunting in caves, While anatomically modern humans supposedly burst out of Africa carrying superior intelligence, superior language, superior culture, and superior humanity itself. Dobzhansky saw continuity. He saw adaptation. He saw regional specialization inside one evolving species. What makes this especially important is that Dobzhansky was writing during a period when ancient DNA did not exist. He reached these conclusions through anatomy, population thinking, and evolutionary reasoning alone. He looked at the evidence and recognized that strict species barriers made little sense. He also recognized something else that later public narratives often tried to suppress. Neanderthals were not primitive in the childish stereotype sense promoted during the late 20th century. They buried their dead. They hunted massive Ice Age animals through organized cooperation. They cared for injured individuals who survived serious trauma. They occupied harsh northern landscapes for immense stretches of time. None of this describes an inferior creature stumbling blindly toward extinction. This understanding of Neanderthals appears repeatedly when somebody starts examining anthropology literature from before the triumph of the strict replacement model. One finds descriptions of Neanderthal ritual behavior, social structure, symbolic activity, and intelligence scattered throughout books written long before the genome era. Anthropologists during the 1950s already described evidence for ceremonial burial and organized social systems. The idea that Neanderthals possessed emotional depth and cultural awareness did not suddenly emerge from modern discoveries. It existed generations ago. Over 100 years ago, anthropologists recognized this as well. In 1918, one British anatomist wrote that everything which could be discovered concerning Neanderthals possessed great value for understanding human origins. That statement reflected a much broader tradition within anthropology that treated Neanderthals not as evolutionary garbage, but as central figures in the human story. This scientist belonged to an era when many anatomists focused intensely upon continuity, transition, and overlapping populations rather than rigid replacement narratives. To them, Neanderthals represented a deeply important chapter in understanding how humanity evolved across Eurasia. Something changed in the 1980s. During the rise of the strict out-of-Africa replacement framework during the late 20th century, the public image of Neanderthals became increasingly distorted. Suddenly, the emphasis shifted toward separation rather than connection. Neanderthals were transformed into evolutionary losers. Their large noses became symbols of primitive adaptation. Their robust skeletons became proof of inferiority rather than specialization. Their disappearance became framed almost like a cleansing event in which superior modern humans replaced archaic populations entirely. Chris Stringer himself even acknowledged how extreme some interpretations of the replacement framework became. He noted that critics described the theory as implying dispersals of killer Africans who wiped out other human populations in a kind of prehistoric holocaust. Others attacked the theory as anti-evolutionary because it denied hybridization and emphasized near-total replacement. This criticism emerged because the strongest forms of the replacement model began sounding strangely disconnected from the messy reality of evolution itself. Evolution usually operates through contact, mixture, adaptation, and partial continuity. Yet the strict replacement narrative often sounded more like a clean biblical reset in which one pure population emerged from a single homeland and erased all others without meaningful genetic contribution. That resemblance to creation narratives disturbed many observers. The irony became difficult to ignore. A theory presented as the triumph of modern evolutionary science increasingly resembled a purified origin myth centered around one chosen lineage spreading across the world untouched by deep regional ancestry. The older anthropologists had often imagined something far more complicated and biologically realistic. They expected interbreeding because hybridization appears throughout nature. They expected overlapping populations because evolution rarely moves in perfectly separated lines. The modern DNA evidence eventually shattered the clean replacement image. Neanderthal ancestry appeared inside living Eurasians. Denisovan ancestry appeared across parts of Asia and Oceania. Additional unidentified archaic ancestry emerged inside several populations. Human evolution suddenly looked exactly like the tangled network that older scholars such as Dobzhansky anticipated. Instead of a single pure dispersal replacing everything in its path, humanity turned out to be an interconnected system of populations meeting, separating, adapting, and merging repeatedly across enormous stretches of time. This is why the older writings feel so unsettling when somebody returns to them after hearing modern, simplified narratives. The old anthropologists were not always correct in their details, but many possessed a broader evolutionary instinct that became overshadowed by ideological certainty. They recognized that human populations interacted. They recognized that anatomy graded into anatomy rather than splitting neatly into isolated boxes. They recognized that intelligence, ritual behavior, and social organization did not suddenly appear out of nowhere inside one magical population. The treatment of Neanderthal noses reveals this shift especially clearly. During the late 20th century, the large Neanderthal nasal opening became almost symbolic within popular science writing. It was frequently described as evidence for cold adaptation, separating Neanderthals sharply from modern humans supposedly adapted to warm African climates. Yet the situation was never that simple. Large nasal dimensions appear in many human populations, including some living Native American groups and northern Eurasian populations. Meanwhile, many tropical populations also display wide and tall nasal structures. Human facial anatomy reflects multiple pressures including airflow, humidity, body size, growth patterns, genetics, and population history. The oversimplistic argument that a smaller modern human nose proved warm-adapted superiority gradually collapsed under closer examination. If modern humans were fundamentally warm-adapted tropical specialists, why did they thrive across Ice Age Eurasia so rapidly? Why do so many cold-adapted modern populations possess facial features overlapping with archaic humans? Why do robust Ice Age Europeans sometimes display facial proportions approaching those of earlier populations? The reality turned out far more complicated than the neat categories promoted during the height of replacement theory enthusiasm. The tragedy is not simply that public understanding became oversimplified. The deeper issue is that entire generations absorbed a distorted emotional image of Neanderthals themselves. They became symbols of failure. Schoolchildren grew up hearing the word Neanderthal used as an insult meaning stupid, primitive, or brutish. Yet this image contradicted what many anthropologists already knew generations earlier. Neanderthals survived brutal Ice Age environments for immense spans of time. They mastered fire. They crafted sophisticated stone tools. They hunted dangerous animals at close range. They cared for wounded group members. They buried their dead. Some evidence even pointed toward pigments, ornaments, feathers, and symbolic objects. None of this resembles an evolutionary dead end, lacking intelligence or humanity. The rediscovery of Dobzhansky's words therefore carries enormous symbolic importance. Here stood one of the founders of evolutionary genetics openly stating during the 1950s that Neanderthals belonged to the same species as us and that hybridization occurred. He recognized that replacement alone could not explain the evidence. He understood that evolution operates through populations, not cartoon categories. He also understood something modern discussions sometimes forget. The purpose of evolutionary science is not to protect simplistic narratives, but to follow evidence wherever it leads. That older generation also lacked one major temptation that shaped public anthropology since the 1980s. They were not operating inside a media system obsessed with clean narratives, heroic origins, and simplified diagrams. Modern narratives often demand certainty. Documentaries demand clarity. Museums demand simple timelines. Textbooks demand easy categories. Yet human evolution stubbornly refuses to behave that way. Every decade, the picture becomes messier rather than cleaner. New fossils appear in unexpected places. Ancient genomes reveal hidden ancestry. Populations once treated as isolated suddenly turn out connected through gene exchange. Even the concept of species becomes unstable when discussing ancient humans. Dobzhansky understood this problem deeply because he spent his career thinking about genetics and variation. Nature does not always produce absolute boundaries. Populations can differ dramatically in anatomy while still exchanging genes under certain conditions. Wolves and coyotes do it, bears do it, early humans clearly did it as well. The idea that Neanderthals and modern humans remained perfectly isolated despite overlapping territories increasingly appears biologically absurd. This is why some critics called the strict replacement framework anti-evolutionary. Evolution does not normally erase complexity in favor of purity, yet the strongest forms of replacement theory promoted exactly that image. One pure lineage emerges. Other lineages vanish. No meaningful blending occurs. Humanity becomes a singular chosen branch, moving across the earth untouched by deep interaction. To many observers, that resembled biblical Garden of Eden narratives more than messy Darwinian population dynamics. The irony became even sharper after the DNA revolution. Suddenly, the same institutions that once insisted interbreeding never happened began carefully adjusting their language. Neanderthals became close cousins. Hybridization became accepted reality. Ancient population mixture became central to the human story. Yet the public rarely heard how many earlier anthropologists had already anticipated this outcome. The older thinkers who argued for continuity and interaction were quietly forgotten, while newer narratives took center stage. That historical amnesia matters because it reveals how science itself moves through fashion, authority, and institutional momentum. Ideas rise, ideas fall. Certain interpretations become dominant not simply because evidence demands it, but because they fit cultural expectations at a particular moment. During the late 20th century, strict replacement models aligned with a desire for clean origins and sharp biological boundaries. Recent discoveries complicated that simplicity. Now the older writings return with strange new relevance. Dobzhansky sounds modern again. The anatomists and craniologists sound modern again. The anthropologists who emphasized continuity, interaction, and shared humanity suddenly appear far less outdated than they once did. Their conclusions no longer sound eccentric after ancient genomes revealed widespread interbreeding across Eurasia and beyond. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside this story concerns humility. The human story never fits neatly inside ideological boxes for very long. Every generation believes it finally solved the mystery. Every generation eventually discovers that earlier scholars understood certain things better than expected. The Neanderthal question reveals this pattern perfectly. The people once mocked as primitive failures turned out genetically intertwined with living humanity. The old anthropologists dismissed as outdated had already predicted important pieces of the truth, and the supposedly settled story of human origins continues growing stranger with every passing year. Thank you for watching. If this story reveals anything, it is that the history of anthropology itself contains mysteries almost as fascinating as the fossils buried beneath the earth. Ideas rise and collapse. Forgotten scholars suddenly sound prophetic. Old books dismissed as obsolete begin speaking again with unsettling clarity. And somewhere between the caves of Ice Age Europe, the laboratories of modern genetics, and the dusty pages written by men like Dobzhansky and others, a larger question still waits quietly in the background. Human origins never formed a simple straight line. The deeper somebody looks, the more humanity appears connected through countless ancient meetings, migrations, and shared bloodlines stretching across the ancient world.